Good evening. Welcome to the Harvard Art Museums and to this evening's program, Perspectives on New Media in Museums. My name is Casper Denavi, and I'm a rising junior living in Dudley House, concentrating in visual and environmental studies with a secondary in the history of art and architecture. This year, I've also worked as a student assistant in the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art, where I've helped in particular to develop the technical glossary you will find upstairs in the Nam June Paik exhibition. I'm delighted to welcome you to the museum on behalf of our student community. Please now be sure to turn off your cell phones and help us to warmly welcome Martha Tedeschi, the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museums.
Thank you, Casper, and a warm welcome to you all. As you've just heard, I'm Martha Tedeschi, Director of the Harvard Art Museums, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight for a most intriguing conversation. We're grateful to Kate Lewis, the Agnes Gund Chief Conservator at the Museum of Modern Art, for coming here to speak with us on the occasion of our exhibition, Nam June Paik, Screenplay. Kate is a leader in the developing field of new media conservation, and we are eager to hear her perspective as we think through the exciting opportunities and challenges of presenting such work here at the Harvard Art Museums. Her presence tonight also attests to the importance of collaborating and sharing ideas across the museum field as we seek to develop greater sensitivity and expertise in the unconventional materials of contemporary art. This evening's discussion would not be possible if not for the generosity of a dear museum friend who is here with us tonight. Ken Hakuda, who has an MBA from the Harvard Business School, 1977, is not only a Harvard Business School alum, he's also the nephew of our artist tonight, our featured artist, Nam June Paik. The current exhibition celebrates an extraordinary gift of works from the Paik estate, along with major funding for a fellowship to support original research on Paik that will extend far into the future. Ken has been an active and indeed transformative member of our museum family. His generosity has included personal invitations to visit the Paik estate and to think aloud with him about how to represent his uncle's groundbreaking career within our collection to an audience of students and a broader community as well. Ken has also shown foresight and great generosity in funding the Nam June Paik Research Fellowship, which will generate research and writing that will have long-term effects on the field of Paik scholarship and on the circle around this important artist. He is committed to the museums as a teaching institution and a training ground for future museum professionals and leaders. His gift places the Harvard Art Museums, through this focus on Paik, within a broader context of innovation in science, technology, and new media in the city of Boston. Describing his time as an artist in residence at the public television station WGBH, Paik once said, quote, "Boston is small enough to do experimental work, but large enough so that success here can be heard around the world." Now I'm pleased to introduce Marina Isgro, the inaugural Nam June Paik Research Fellow at the Harvard Art Museums, who's helped to bring Nam June Paik Screenplay to life, and who will introduce tonight's speaker and program. Marina. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. As Martha said, my name is Marina Isgro. I'm the first Nam June Paik Research Fellow here at the Harvard Art Museums, and I'll be introducing Kate Lewis tonight. Following our program, the exhibition will be open on the third floor, so I strongly encourage you to stop by and see the work in person. Before we begin, just a few additional thanks are in order. Support for Nam June Paik Screenplay was provided by the Rosenblatt Fund for Post-War American Art, the Agnes Gund Fund for Modern and Contemporary Art, and the José Soriano Fund. Support for tonight's lecture is provided by the M. Victor Leventritt Fund, which was established through the generosity of the wife, children, and friends of the late M. Victor Leventritt, Harvard class of 1935. The purpose of the fund is to present outstanding scholars in the history and theory of art to the Harvard and Greater Boston communities. In addition, modern and contemporary art programs at the Harvard Art Museums are made possible in part by generous support from the Emily Rauh Pulitzer and Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Fund for Modern and Contemporary Art. So now I'd like to start by giving you a brief overview of Nam June Paik's work and our exhibition. Paik was one of the most innovative artists of the 20th century, whose work established the field of video art and paved the way for the media and technology-based practices that form such an integral part of the art world today. A truly global artist, Paik was born in Korea, studied in Japan, and built his career in Germany and the United States. Paik crossed artistic mediums as often as he crossed geographic borders. He initially studied musical composition before making his name as a performance artist with the Fluxus Group, and then creating the very first television-based art. Paik debuted his television work in Germany in 1963 in a show called Exposition of Music, Electronic Television, which I'm showing you here. He presented TVs whose wiring he had altered so that they transformed broadcasts into distorted, swirling images or completely abstract lines and forms. Alongside them, he exhibited pianos whose inner workings he had also modified in surprising ways. For example, pressing certain keys might switch off the room's lighting, activate a vacuum cleaner, or turn on a radio. The fact that Paik paired these groups of works suggests that he perceived a continuity between music and television as time-based mediums, and that he understood both pianos and televisions as instruments that could be pushed to produce new forms of aesthetic experience. Paik once said that he wanted to investigate the boundary regions between different fields, from music to visual art, hardware to software, electronics to humanities, and to find ways to bridge them. It is this radical fusion of apparently disparate worlds that allowed Paik to leave such a distinct mark on the art of his time, and that we've aimed to highlight in our exhibition. As we've heard, Nam June Paik's screenplay, which I co-curated with Mary Schneider Enriquez, features an exceptional gift from Ken Hakuda. 11 works from the Paik estate form the core of the exhibition, where they are complemented by selections from the museum's collections and archives. And here I'm showing you the exhibition's first gallery. A centerpiece of the show that speaks to Paik's fusion of mediums is TV Crown, which dates to the early years of the artist's career. So he made the first version of this in 1965, and ours is from 1999. Here, the artist rewired a television and connected it to 2 audio generators, causing it to display silent, dancing images of sound waves, an effect that Paik referred to as physical music. In early exhibitions of this work, Paik encouraged visitors to adjust the controls to modify the size and shape of the pattern on its screen. In doing so, he transformed the television, which normally serves as a receiver for identical centralized broadcasts, into a fully participatory tool for play and experimentation. A second aim of our exhibition is to illuminate the deep relationships and collaborations that Paik fostered with other artists throughout his life. Paik was a visionary figure who pioneered the fields of television and video art, but he also understood that the best discoveries often result from encounters with other people. One of the first works you'll see upon entering the show is Cello Memory from 2002, a work that Paik created in homage to his longtime collaborator Charlotte Moorman about a decade after her death. The work features historical footage of Moorman, a classically trained cellist turned avant-garde performance artist. In a heavily edited collage-like video, we see her interacting with sculptural props and costumes that Paik made for her, including a cello and glasses made from televisions. By weaving this archival footage into a new sculptural assemblage, Paik reanimates it and gives it new life beyond its role as documentation. In our second gallery, which you're seeing here, we focus primarily on Paik's collaborations with the Fluxus Group and the artist Joseph Beuys, drawing from the museum's strong holdings in those areas, and situating Paik within a broader picture of experimental art in the post-war period. Overlooking that room is another homage by Paik, an untitled work from 1993 to 95 commemorating George Maciunas, the leader of Fluxus, who aimed to make art more accessible and closer to everyday life. Paik felt that Maciunas, with his production of low-cost art multiples, had made a crucial intervention into the ways art is distributed, much as Paik sought to do in his own work with television. So in this work, Paik modifies a photograph of Maciunas taken by the Fluxus photographer Peter Moore. He inserts a tiny television in its chest and a toy robot at its feet, interweaving marks of his own persona into this portrait of his friend. Finally, we end the exhibition with a spotlight on a local connection, Paik's work with WGBH-TV in Boston, where he created his very first piece for broadcast television in 1969, and I'm showing you a still from that piece here. In this early work, called Electronic Opera No. 1, Paik created a visual collage from swirling images of Richard Nixon, dancing hippies, and abstract electronic imagery taped off of his television sculptures or created with WGBH engineers. Over a soundtrack of classical music, Paik's voice can be heard instructing viewers to open their eyes, close their eyes, and ultimately to turn off their television sets. The imagery and techniques that he invented in this piece and in other projects at WGBH made a lasting mark on his videos that remained long after he left Boston. In one of his many visionary statements in 1982, Paik predicted that, quote, "Video installations will become like opera, in which only the score will be handed down to the next generation. It will be up to later curators and museum workers," he thought, "to reinterpret these installations and bring them back to life." We have been so lucky to have an incredible team here to realize Paik's scores. Mary and I would like to thank our director, Martha Tedeschi, Lynette Roth, Sarah Kianowski, and Jessica Ficken in the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art, Tony Siegel and the Strauss Center, Ellie Glynn, Karen Gausch, Katie Press, and the whole collections management team, especially Eric Lindahl and Sean Lunsford, Ian Callahan in digital infrastructure and emerging technologies, Molly Ryan and Chris Malinsky in the Division of Academic and Public Programming, and Micah Bias and his colleagues in communications. We'd also like to thank John Huffman of the Paik Estate. And of course, I would like to express my personal thanks to Ken Hakuda for his incredible generosity in making my fellowship and this exhibition possible. As all of us who worked on this exhibition have learned, Paik's work presents considerable challenges to conservators, who must reckon with the inevitable obsolescence of the artist's technological materials. In fact, Paik's work has become something of an emblem for the thorny conservation issues raised by media art more broadly. Not only television and video, but also the digital, internet-based, and virtual work that artists are increasingly producing today. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Kate Lewis, the Agnes Gund Chief Conservator of the Museum of Modern Art's David Booth Conservation Center and Department. A specialist in time-based media who has treated artworks ranging from an early Paik sculpture to a contemporary video game, Kate has had a long and varied career that attests to the extraordinary expansion of media art since Paik picked up his first television in the early 1960s. Kate first joined MoMA as media conservator in 2013, after 8 years at Tate London. At MoMA, she oversees the care, treatment, research, and display of the museum's collection, and leads a Mellon Foundation initiative to address the long-term preservation of media art. Beyond the museum, she has been a major voice promoting education in media conservation and introducing her field to a wider public through workshops and talks with Tech Focus, Voices in Contemporary Art, and other organizations. Today, she will share a series of case studies revealing the unique challenges that new media art can present in the museum setting. Following her talk, she will be joined for a discussion with Mary Schneider Enriquez, and we will open it up to audience questions. So please join me in welcoming Kate Lewis.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you to Chris, who originally contacted me, and to Mary and Marina for their really kind invitation to talk with you this evening. And I'm oh, I can move that. Can you hear me? No. Are we using, sorry. Oh, okay, all right. Sorry, I thought I was using this mic, but I'm not. Sorry, apologies. And I was particularly thrilled to come at this moment to have the opportunity to see this exhibition, Screenplay, and actually learn more about the generous gift from Ken Hakuta to the Harvard Art Museums. And I really look forward to following the scholarship that this fellowship sort of generates over the coming years. So over the next kind of 40 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the conservation of two of Paik's works that I've treated, quite small kind of works, but I'm going to use that as a springboard to kind of touch on sort of some just broader issues in media conservation. And I'm looking at the audience, and I can see a number of very eminent conservation colleagues are also here too. Thank you for coming this evening. So if there are any bigger questions that I can't answer, I know somebody in the audience will be able to. So for those of you who are not so familiar with conservation, let's just kind of dial back a minute and think about what conservation is more broadly. So we have painting conservators. This is my colleague Michael Duffy at MoMA. Our collections, our conservation departments tend to reflect what we have in our collections. So at MoMA we have painting. Our first painting conservator started in 1958 when we had a fire. Paper conservators, here's Erica Mosier treating a work by Lee Bonteque. Leanne Daphne, looking at an early 19th century salted paper print photograph. Here's our sculpture conservation studio, that's Ellen Moody, one of our associate sculpture conservators. Chris McGlinchey, conservation scientist, doing microfading on a contemporary chromogenic colour print, and media conservation. So this is the newest department at MoMA. It was started in 2007. So not that new, but quite new, really, in the grand scheme of things. These are our two fellows. As Marina mentioned, we have a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to look at training in media conservation at the moment. So this is Caroline Gill and Flaminia Fortunato, and actually they're looking at a software-based piece here by Rafael Lozano Hema called 33 Questions Per Minute, which is interactive. So MoMA has approximately 250,000 works. I think it's kind of equivalent to the collections here. And about 3,000 of those are media, probably about 2/3 are actually video works. So what we have and how we preserve it is a complex issue, considering a vast array of objects and technologies that comprise each of these artworks. Media conservators identify and assess the risks to a work of art from agents of deterioration and change, just as our more traditional colleagues might assess the deterioration of paper, paint, or plastic. So like our traditional colleagues, our endeavour is the same, to carefully document and manage change over time while respecting the essence of a work. We all age, all our ages as well. Maybe just with media it just seems more kind of clear because there's this kind of technical obsolescence. These works have been described as being beyond the static object. They're inherently dynamic and obviously rely on technology for exhibition, placing them in this realm of the ever-evolving and changing technological environment. So what do media conservators look after? So top left is a video piece with a kind of construction that gets built every time on front of it. Bottom left, that's actually a video game for a single player person. You are Super Mario in the corner and you walk around the gallery with a wireless interactive kind of game. Top right, 60mm film. We have an app. We actually have 4 apps now in MoMA's collection. So this is an app by Martine Sims that we recently acquired, and of course a Nam June Paik. So let's look at Nam June Paik, let's start there. He was a video, as we heard, he's a video artist, a performance artist, a composer, a visionary, one of the most innovative artists in the 20th century. And really being a pioneer and such a prolific and experimental and international artist, his works are actually across many collections in North America and also in Europe. And so for some time has been of great interest to conservators. And actually in 2013, a conference was hosted at the Smithsonian American Art Museum on conserving and exhibiting his works. And actually the former chief conservator of the London Centre who organised that is actually here in the audience today. So works such as TV Crown on the left really epitomise his sculptural TV-based artworks because this work really conceptually and physically relies on cathode ray tube television technology, and I'm now going to say CRT for short. So this TV set, as Marina mentioned, is modified, and then these audio amplifiers are what then take over the control of the electron beam to create this kind of beautiful, kind of moving work. And as mentioned, this work was originally interactive and it now no longer is. So as a conservator, we're already beginning to see a sort of slight change in how these kind of works are experienced in the gallery. On the right, electronic opera. So this is, as Marina mentioned, this was a video. This is not sort of tied to modifying a television. Video is something that we can migrate in a sort of transparent, careful way, but we can migrate video, and it's really not tied to what you show it on. So as a conservator, we already know that we can take different strategies for dealing with the life of these two particular works. So I'm going to jump to this particular work that's in MoMA's collection. It's called Untitled by Nam June Paik and Otto Pina from 1968, acquired by MoMA in 2000. This work was requested for display in the MoMA galleries in 2016. So we took it out and we started having a look at it. So what you're seeing here is a television set, which is about this big. And the plastic casing is kind of encrusted with these plastic beads, which are then painted with a sort of silver paint. So on the top left, you can see the work switched on. So you have this kind of static, but somewhat flickering diagonal line. And in the bottom right, that's the television switched off. So again, this is a modified television. And what you might notice on the bottom right is there's actually this kind of grey diagonal line across the screen. So by focusing the electron beam, normally it's kind of moving across the surface because you have a flickering image. But by modifying it in this way, you're focusing the beam, and actually there's a phosphor paint painted on the internal surface of that glass of what you see the image on, and having that electron beam focused on that has actually burnt a line into that. So it's kind of interesting that we kind of still see the kind of ghost of that line when the work is actually switched off. We don't know when that happened. It was like that when it came into the collection. It probably happened pretty quickly, actually. So there are many technologies that we deal with, and we can't be an expert in everything. So I'd like to introduce you to CTN Louie. This is also known as CT Louie, who's based in New York. He did work with Nam June Paik for many years, and we're lucky that he's in New York, and also Raphael Shirley. I'm really sorry, you can only see part of her head there, who is a sort of a long-term collaborator with CT Louie, but also worked for Nam June Paik. So not being an expert in these televisions, we thought it would make sense to, when we're assessing this and thinking about how to display it, to bring in some other people who really understand this kind of cathode ray tube television technology. So we opened it up, checked the wiring, checked the circuit board, wrote down all the sort of bits and parts that are inside. That's Alex Nichols, who was our fellow at MoMA at the time in the picture. This is just a couple of details. That's a very traditional conservation image there. We're actually using a conservation vacuum cleaner, not really media conservation, but more an objects conservation, to remove all of the dust that are in the back, because if there's dust, it could get quite hot. And on the left here, you can see that actually some of the beads are missing. So we discussed with the curator, what do we think about that? And it was decided we just leave it. actually on the front it looks good. Do we need to really add something that we don't have anymore to the sides? So we decided to leave it as it was, although we did kind of do a surface cleaning. So thinking about this work has a finite life, but many works in our collections have a finite life. Watercolors fade over time, and as paper conservators in museums use strategies to limit the amount of time that they're on display because we want to keep the life going of that work. Obviously some watercolors, pigments, dyes are more fragile than others, but we kind of take a sort of general approach. Some museums might say, well, you can show this watercolor for 3 months every 2 years as a way of kind of like keeping its life going for longer because light damage is cumulative. So in discussion with the curator, we're like, okay, well, how long is this TV set going to last? How many hours are left on that screen? C.T. Louie couldn't. It's very difficult to predict, so even somebody who's been working with TVs for 50 years couldn't say for sure. So we decided to take a similar approach to our watercolor approach, which is something that is traditional and understood in museums. This had been requested for 12 months, and we said, okay, let's show it for 3 months and we'll monitor it while it was on display. So that was just like one approach or one idea. Okay. So, what we also did, what you're seeing here is a sort of like a backup. So what can we do with technology? Well, we can buy backups. We couldn't find the same model as the TV that we were looking at, but what we did with C.T. Louie is we found something that was the same size and shape. And what we've done is we've removed it from its casing, and we worked with C.T. Louie to create that diagonal line. So what does this mean? Why did we do that? What does that mean for the future? How might we use it? One of the ideas was, should the tube fail, could we replace it with a new one? The issue with this work is that actually, if we go back, those beads are actually stuck on the glass screen. They are not just on the plastic. So to remove it would damage the object to a certain extent. Jim Coddington, who was the former chief of conservation at MoMA, a painting conservator, I was discussing with him at the time, and he said this reminds him of an Arthur Dove sculpture in MoMA's collection, which is basically a sort of case, and a small element inside has broken. But to get in and fix it, you basically have to like crack open this object as a sort of act of vandalism. So it seems sort of like a similar challenge with this. But we have it, people can turn it on, they can look at it, they can understand it, and what we're doing is we're not saying we're not making a decision now, it's just like we're gathering tools and information to help our future conservators make some decisions, and I really hope that I'm not the one who has to be involved in making that decision, and it certainly wouldn't be one, it would be many people who would be involved in that discussion. So, Zen for TV. This was also requested for the same exhibition. And this work is sort of similar, but also very different at the same time. So again, it's a modified television, this time with a vertical line with the orientation of the television switched. This work, I think, was originally shown in '63, but actually this monitor is from the 1980s. So already we've seen this kind of change over time. I know the original monitors were nothing was saved, as I understand, from that first exhibition. What's interesting about this piece is that actually there's a sticky label on the back. So the television hasn't been painted, there's no signatures or anything on it, but there is a sticky label that says TV clock. And actually Michael Mansfield, who was one of the curators at the Smithsonian Museum who oversaw the Paik archive there, he was at MoMA having a look at some things with us. And he said, oh yeah, we've got a number of those in the storage of the Paik archives. And actually, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of it, but when this one is switched off, we saw that burnt-in diagonal line. On this one, you have the burnt-in vertical line, but there's also a burnt-in diagonal line. As I understand it, TV clock is almost like a sundial. So you go into a room and there's a series of televisions with them going. So this one had actually been repurposed. And I mention that because it's all about building a picture about artists' approach and how they use technology. So with this work, we did the same thing. We found some other monitors where the glass tubes are the same size. We couldn't find the exact model. So here you can see it kind of set up. So again, like the idea that there's some sort of future strategy or at least other information available to the institution. Zen for TV to me appears more mutable. I just did a quick Google search and all of these came up. That sort of also tells you something about this particular work. So I think these two examples are quite nice of how we take a sort of case-by-case approach to each artwork, even when it's the same technology by the same artist. So I'm now going to sort of move to kind of like some broader questions about media-based works, but kind of sticking with this kind of idea of analog work. So on the left, we have a 35mm slide-based work by the artist Anthony McCall, and on the right, a 60mm film work by Oscar Boney. So these works, kind of similar to the monitors, are very much tied to a very sort of particular display technology that we kind of look at and see as obsolete. However, we can still support both of these mediums. Slide film is now obsolete. Nobody's making it anymore. 60mm film is still made, but there's a lot less options out there. The slide projector, that particular one, the Kodak Carousel, was discontinued in 2004, but it was so popular, nearly every academic institution and school and library would have had these slide projectors. Certainly when I studied art history, it was all slide projectors. So there's a lot of them available, and eBay is like a media conservator and a contemporary artist conservator's best friend. So we spend a lot of time on eBay. The same thing with the 60mm film projectors. So with these works, you don't show that original slide that the artist gave you, because actually the slide projector, the dyes on the slides are quite fragile. They will actually fade quite rapidly. 16mm film, when you work in a museum that's open 7 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's a lot of physical kind of wear and tear on the film. 60mm film has these kind of perforations down the side, and the projector has these teeth that grab those perforations, and that's what pulls it through to the projector to make this moving image. So over 70 hours in a week, that's a lot of physical wear and tear on that film. So basically we make exhibition copies as closely as we possibly can. I now know of 2 slide labs, one in North America and one in Europe, where we can still do very nice duplication of the slides from our original materials. Nowadays, some people have actually stockpiled slide film, but it's very difficult to buy now, even on eBay. But another option is one lab that's very good uses actually sheet film and then cuts it up to the size of a slide. So we can support these mediums. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, it's complicated, you need a lot of backups, but it can be done. So we thought a little bit about technology and how technology affects a work. Let's now think a little bit about exhibitions. So I'm just going to play a little video for you.
The 40-part motet is an audio installation that consists of 40 speakers, and out of every single speaker is a singer's voice. So it's a virtual choir singing a piece of music from the mid-1500s by Thomas Tallis called Spaminalian. I was attracted to the piece of music because of the complexity of it, being 40 different harmonies, the emotional beauty of it. I saw it as a sculpture, so that when you walk into the space, the sound is so three-dimensional for you that it's like walking into a piece of music.
It's great to finish with these two ladies. So I just wanted to show this piece. This is a very popular work, but what I wanted to kind of show with this video is that these works, these installations are really very much about an experience. And when they're in storage, these artworks do not exist. So we might receive guidelines from an artist, but I would say that the process of installation is actually an act of preservation for any installation-based work. I think it's a bit like a cooking recipe. I'm a really bad cook, so I need a recipe that's like really clear, and it's not until I work through it do I know if I'm missing something, and then I get to eat the cake, right? So I think any sort of manual, I think, is always written with some assumed knowledge. So no matter how detailed the guidelines might be, I think you really need to go through the act of installation to begin to sort of institutionally, because we're talking from an institutional perspective, to kind of really begin to learn these works and sort of build up a kind of internal kind of knowledge. And it's not just technical knowledge, it's spatial, it's all those intangible elements, such as how loud should it be? Is there particular acoustics that space needs? Maybe the artist actually wants to tweak the projector because the red is a bit orange and it needs to be much more redder. So these are really important things you can only really learn through that process of installation. And of course, working with more contemporary media, sometimes we're very lucky that the artist is still around and we can work with the artist. So I think installation is also this moment of collaboration with the artist as you work through these different kind of requirements of exhibition. And I think this can allow time and space to develop an empathy for the piece, permitting a better sort of understanding both of the artist and the artist's opinions and feelings towards certain aspects of the work. And ideally, one would have a sort of gradual accumulation of these encounters. Ideally, over 10, 20 years, it would be nice to install it multiple times with the artist. I think that's probably a luxury that we won't all have, but that would be ideal, because I think this will aid the conservators and also our collection colleagues in museums to really better understand the different technical, ephemeral, and how those conceptual elements and how all of these kind of coalesce, and thus inform our ongoing stewardship of these works. This is a piece that we installed a couple of years ago by Nalini Malani, Game Pieces. This is the first time that we installed this piece. And who you see in the right image, kind of holding the bottom of one of those sort of large painted kind of tubes, is Johan, who is her assistant, also her husband, and travels to install these works. So it was really great to work with him when we first installed this piece. Documentation is fundamental to all conservation practice. It's written into our code of ethics. So this is nothing new or different for media conservation. So the sort of things that we do are wiring diagrams, architectural elevations, lists of equipment that were used, photographs, videos, oral interviews if we're lucky to have the artist or the artist's assistant there. But what's also really important in this form of documentation is who was involved, why were they involved, how were certain decisions made, and by whom were those decisions made? Because now we just look at a photo, you might have a photo of a work from the 70s, and you don't know why it's done like that. So all of that helps kind of build up this knowledge that we can leave our future colleagues in museums to help kind of shepherd these works into the future. So reflective documentation is really important. I just show this piece because this is Steve McQueen, static, and that looks really similar, but it also looks really different. We were in a dark room with a carpet and black walls. The other room is a light-filled space. So we're already seeing this really big change in this work. And actually, I was very lucky to visit the conservation labs here earlier today, and the fellow Madeline was talking about an art piece that has changed so many times through installation. So we know these works are mutable. So how are they mutable, and what is it that we can learn from the artist now to help kind of guide that, knowing that they are variable by nature? So let's get a bit more technical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about digital stuff now in a very sort of quick, light way, but when I started in media conservation back in 2005, this is what a video artwork looked like when it was arrived in our lab. We'd have a big videotape, which was the master file, and then we'd have DVDs, which are, for those of you who might not know, are the round, white, circular things on the right. The videotapes are the ones on the left. And maybe a set of instructions. This is probably a 2-channel video work, I think maybe by Douglas Gordon. But now it's arriving like this. It's coming on USB hard drives, Thunderbolt hard drives, thumb drives. We might download it as an FTP from a server. So we're seeing a really big shift. So what does that mean for us and our collections? Well, we really need to kind of shift to start caring for these digital medias. So earlier on, you saw Erica, my colleague, the paper conservator, mending something at her workbench. This is my workbench. This is my digital workbench. And what you see, I've put a big red arrow. It's a little black box, but basically that's a USB hard drive that's about the size of this. And it's plugged into a write blocker. And then the write blocker is plugged into my computer. So when a work of art of paper arrives, you know that you're not going to use dirty hands to touch it, or you're going to wear white gloves, and you're going to keep it flat, sort of sandwiched between very nice mat board, and then you're going to put it in a beautiful box, and you're going to keep it in the dark at the right temperature. So we need to apply exactly those parameters to our digital works. So our write blocker here, when you plug a hard drive or a thumb drive into your computer, what most of you won't know is actually your computer writes invisible files to it saying, oh, hello, I just copied this file at this time, blah, blah, blah. So we're thinking about technical art history here, and I'm thinking about these hard drives in the future that artists supplied to museums in the mid-2000s. In 50 years' time, that might be really interesting to technical art historians. So we really want to make sure that we're not leaving any thumbprints on our hard drives that were supplied by artists. So we're using these tools. This basically stops my computer writing anything to the artist's hard drive. And then we use different kind of software that allows us to move our files from our hard drive into our computers without making any changes. And then the other thing that you can see here on the screen, I don't know whether you can really read it. I mean, don't worry. We also use software that allows us to gather very verbose information about a file. So I'm just going to flick forward. I know there's at least one conservation scientist in the audience. So this is Anna Martins, a conservation scientist at MoMA. We were lucky to borrow a piece of equipment that basically does elemental mapping using XRF fluorescence. And so this is a painting by Modigliani, and it's been scanned, and what you're seeing here is the different layers of elements that are in that painting. So where you see mercury, then it's likely that the artist has used the paint vermilion. So when I look at this, I would like to propose to you all that that's kind of the equivalent. So I'm doing technical analysis on these files. So I know that that video is going to have to migrate. So what I want to do is create a condition report that gives you all the technical characteristics of that file. So as that migrates into the future, you know what it was originally like when the artist gave it to you at that institution. So should anything change over time during that migration, you have a way of tracking those changes. This is my colleague, Peter Alexic, Associate Media Conservator at MoMA. And basically, he's doing condition checking, a very traditional conservation approach. With a painting, you might spend a very long time looking at the front and the back under different lights and looking at every single sort of corner of that picture. Here with video, this is a video by Richard Serra called Boomerang. And what we do is we watch the whole video. So if it's a 5-channel work that's each channel's 1 hour long by Bruce Nauman, we watch the whole thing. And then what you can see is he's got different tools here. So he's using different monitors. There's a CRT, there's a flat screen. But then on here, there's also scopes that allow us to kind of like read the color and the contrast and everything in those files. So we'll write that condition report, recording that information. Again, it's a baseline, so in the future, when you want to look at that file, you can see if any changes have been made because of technology. So Okay, so we've got some digital files, so we really need to store them just like we store our other artwork. So on the left you can see cold storage for our film, on the right we've got some videotapes, so in the middle is the new storage, it's a digital art vault. So we store our traditional objects appropriately, we really need to store our digital objects appropriately. So this is kind of like the new frontier for museums. In the digital preservation world, the sort of golden rule is 3 copies and at least 2 geographic locations. So the benefit that we have here, obviously you can't multiply your Picasso, but you can save multiple copies of these files, which are quite fragile. But they're stored just like a painting. They're locked up, there's limited access. We have software that runs integrity checks, so it's checking the condition of those works while it's in storage, like have any bits flipped, and if something happens, then we've always got another copy. So that's a whirlwind tour of some of the issues that we deal with in media conservation, but also actually I would argue in contemporary art conservation in general. So let's come back to this beautiful work by Nam June Paik. So what's really important is knowing your artist and really knowing your medium. Nothing new there. Thinking ahead, that's what we do as conservators. We think ahead, although we can really only deal with the present. I would argue that installing these works is an act of preservation, as well as building this very kind of reflective documentation that includes the artist's voice, if you're lucky enough to have the artist and work with them, thinking about preservation and storage. And it's just a really exciting field as well. Currently at MoMA, one of our conservators is doing research into how do you conserve sound in a museum collection. We haven't really thought about that very much, so she's working on that at the moment. And one of our fellows is looking in how to conserve apps. I know how to use an app, I have no idea how to conserve it. So it's really great that we've got one of our fellows kind of beginning to sort of tackle some of these issues. So artists like Nam June Paik will continue to push change and adapt media in ways in which it was never intended to be used. And we know that these technologies will kind of obsolescence at some point. So for conservators, artists like Nam June Paik keep us on our toes, challenging us both with the technological but also with philosophical questions about what it means to be stewards of these works. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Is this on? Yes, sounds like it is. So I'm Mary Schneider Enriquez, the Associate Curator of Modern Contemporary Art here, who had the pleasure of working with Marina on doing this exhibition, and it was with great enthusiasm that we invited Kate, and we're thrilled she could come. And I have a couple of what we're going to do is I'm going to ask her a couple of questions, and we're going to open it up for all of you, because this generous gift of these great objects by Nam June have been a really important part of our teaching mission and our collection at the Harvard Art Museums, which spans to from the ancient to the present. And some of the challenges these works have posed for us, you have hit upon in a way that we don't have the same number of digital works in our collection, but the Nam June works have really set up a whole series of questions that, in the wonderful relationship I enjoy with our conservation staff, has really put us time and again at a place of asking the questions that you focused on. The issues of obsolescence and how do we care for, an ancient sculpture is one thing, but one of Nam June's works with television sets that are no longer findable, or they are on eBay, as you pointed out, and I understand there's also a gentleman in New York who actually collects all these old TVs. So it's required us to do the kinds of research into backups for preservation and care of these works that actually are a whole series of new questions for us. And it's very exciting, it's also daunting. And I think for all of us, in ways that your talk tonight allowed us to see possibility and take away some of the worry. But coming back to something you said, and I'd like to talk further about, is this fact that realizing obsolescence is there. And even when you make backup copies and you have 3 copies of whether it's the slides or the films, or you figure out a way to get into the television screen and remove whatever the burn is on that. How do we think down the road? And you said some of this will be left open to those who follow us as to their next steps, but how should we be thinking about, in the case particularly of Nam June's work, how many backup copies of television sets we need to be storing in our limited storage space, just to make sure that when we show it, it can keep working long enough so we can really teach and work with it. I mean, some of the stuff that is going to be obsolete sooner than later, and some of it already is. When you as a conservator are thinking about that in terms of MoMA, in terms of working with curators, how do you guys bridge that and think about the going forward part? Because there are ramifications, even machines that may not be able to read all that incredible code that you clearly have so brilliantly preserved. And maybe not, maybe since I'm not a high-tech person, I'm wrong on that. I'd love you to open that window a little further.
So in terms of your question about like how many backups or?
Both backups and thinking about making those backups and the decisions down the road of the next generation who care for these. How do you give as much information as possible, and you hope that the machines that will be made going forward will be able to read what you've created as backup, whether it's a television set that does or doesn't exist in the future, or something far more sophisticated like Lorenzo Hammer's films that obviously are at another stage than what Nam June was doing in the 60s and 70s.
I mean, I think there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
There is no kind of sort of easy way to deal with it. And I think basically we do the best we can. And acquiring backups, I'm sure that Ken and John can speak to that a bit more, but acquiring backups is only going to get you so far for so long. It's not going to last for 100 years. Do we expect these works to last for 100 years? That's another question that maybe institutions need to ask. But that's why thinking about the artists and how the artists make decisions and who's making those decisions, working with the estates and working with people who knew that artist to maybe help make some of those decisions. I don't know anything yet that's truly obsolete. I think we're kind of in a sweet moment. And you know, there are strategies that we can put into place, but I don't know what will happen in 100 years. So that's why it's really interesting, as I said, to kind of follow how artists, the mutability of these works, the variability of these works, to follow how artists kind of deal with that over time. So looking at like those works by Steve McQueen, you know, Steve McQueen in the 90s was making video works, and he used something called a cathode ray tube projector. So that's the same technology, but you have 3 tubes in your video projector, a red, a green, and a blue, I think. And they create these beautiful colors, they create a beautiful black. And there's new projector technologies, there's DLPs, there's LCDs, and they all have their own sort of color characteristics when you use them, but none of them actually really look like a CRT projector if you're looking at it. And especially with his early works are black and white, so you really kind of are looking towards that black. Those projectors were used in home cinemas, but home cinemas weren't as prevalent as people having TVs in their house or slide projectors in the academic universities. So those are much more difficult to maintain. And there aren't really any spare parts out for them so much. There are a few people who have things, but they are much more challenging. But as far as I'm aware, Steve hasn't made the shift with those early works to newer projector technologies. He really pushes the institutions. He had a retrospective at the Schaulager, and then I think it went to the Art Institute Chicago, and the insistence was with the early pieces that those projectors are used, not for static, which is a much more recent piece, the one that you saw of the Statue of Liberty. So there's artists who kind of know that you can do it, because sometimes I think there's an easy way out. Oh, I don't want to show 16mm film. It's very maintenance heavy. It keeps breaking while it's in the gallery. I need to make lots of prints. So museums, we think about resources, so people's time, we think about budgets, you know, all of these things kind of come into play. But the fact that the artist is kind of maintaining this. But somebody like Steve McQueen, we have a very long, sort of long history with his work. He's around, he's very knowledgeable. I think he's less around because he's like super famous, superstar film director. But, you know, watching how he makes decisions over time, I know maybe when he shows that work in 10 years' time and it really can't, you know, how did he make those decisions? So as across different institutions, we can like contact our colleagues and say, okay, how were certain decisions made at this particular moment in time? So if you have the luxury, I think, of watching an artist make decisions over their career, because technology changes so quickly, that's another way, that's another strategy that we can use in our tool belt of ideas to try and kind of support these sorts of works. Computer-based works, so code and things like that, that's very different. That's kind of really like, I would say, video art. I'm not going to say that we've got it, but I think we've been looking at video art for a long time and we've kind of watched it evolve. The playback is a different question with the CRTs, but we kind of understand sort of the migration life of video, and I think more contemporary artists are kind of aware of that. But with software-based works, much more challenging, and this is kind of, I think, really one of the frontiers of media conservation, is really trying to work out how these pieces are going to survive using emulation, or are you going to recode it? Do you need to know about this code and that code? So there's all these kind of discussions going on. Actually, Raphael Lozano Hema very interestingly released a manifesto on the preservation of his works on Facebook. He actually makes, even if you buy his work, he actually allows all his code is online, you can download it, all his manuals are online. So he's kind of using this kind of very different approach to like the conservation of his work.
Which then raises a question, not just with his work, but with others, is if it is I mean, in his case, let's use that as the example. When is it no longer his work? I mean, if he always allows others to become a part of it, how do we as a viewer, as a curator, discern difference between his creation and that which has been, and maybe that is the point, it just continually to evolve. But if you're acquiring it for the museum, and for example, with González Torres, we have a document that says that pile of candy must be this way because Felix González Torres says it will be this color candy in this corner, yes? And so, but we have a certificate that basically we acquired that is part of the kind of certainty that that's his work of art, even though we're creating it. When it becomes, is there,
Raphael actually gives certificates. Yeah. I think he actually does like a gold, I don't want to say a gold nugget, but he actually gives something like that's almost like etched in stone. You always get this like tablet now. I think that's his new way. Yeah, so there's still like this certificate. I don't know how many people are actually downloading his work, changing it, and then saying it's their work. I don't think that's going on. So, you know, but it's a really good question posing kind of for the future, right? We look at artist videos that are kind of ripped and put up on the internet, you know, so are they happy with that? Does that matter? Those questions are beginning to kind of sort of percolate there. But I think with Raphael's work, I mean, he gives you a huge manual when you acquire that work, and he's still involved, so one normally works with him to move those works. But I think in the future, that's a really interesting question.
What has been one of the biggest challenges you faced in being a conservator of media art? I mean, because it must be constantly new challenges on the horizon, but what is one that you faced and you just said, whoa, what am I going to do here?
I think apps, I have no idea what to do with those. So, you know, and I think one of the things about working with these sort of works is that you have to be open to the fact that you're not the expert. You know, one can, you know, I've developed expertise in video, but I'm not the expert in every technology. But as an artwork comes along, I will learn about that technology and kind of learn as much as I can. But I'm never going to be able to learn how to code in Delphi, which is what Lozano Hema's original developer used. So kind of learning how to work and collaborate with technology experts, learning how to speak languages with different people. So as a conservator, we're still using our conservation framework, but working with other people kind of beyond that who are specialists, kind of sometimes it takes a while for everybody to kind of get on the same page and learn the same language. But that's what I really enjoy doing, learning.
That's fantastic. Another question. There are works of art created of ephemeral materials in which the artist specifically wanted the work to begin to age with time and ultimately disappear in a sense. I mean, maybe not literally, but become a shadow of what it once was, and art historians and curators write about the death of the object and what it, that process that was very much an important part of the artist's intention. In the case of media art, is there a point at which a work actually follows along a path that no longer is it going to be the same kind of color and form and movement, or however you want to describe what it presents to people, that is allowable, that if the artist does or does not tell us, you as a conservator at MoMA working with the curators say, this is the natural process for this work of art, whether the machines are dying or not, it's okay, this is what they meant it to be, or we will allow it to go that process, or I know that's one of those conservator-curator things that's a little complicated anyway, but I've never thought about it in terms of new media specifically until facing what we've been thinking about in a really interesting way with Paik, to be honest.
I think this is going to sound like a cop-out, but I think it's really case by case.
Yeah.
There are certain works, I can't remember the artist's name, who's one of the YBAs, who used a Sony Walkman that's embedded in a table. Mm-hmm. So using like music cassette tapes that we all used back in the 80s and 90s. And that's very much an aesthetic part of the technology and really important to the artist that it was run on those sort of Sony kind of early portable music players. The artist is no longer around. We can still support those, but at some point we know that that's going to be an issue. So what do? Do you kind of like fake it in some ways and use a media player but have the same audio on it? That's one strategy. Do you show that media player and put it next to the artwork? That's another strategy that I've seen people use. And I think watching what everybody does and the different approaches that people take is really useful, even if it's not the artist, but it's different institutions or curators or conservators, just seeing what do other people do? How are we going to deal with these types of things as they move on? Sometimes you could try that, you could put the media player next to it, but the great thing is next time that you show that, you could do something different because that's kind of an additional thing. But yeah, I don't know. I struggle with talking about deaths of art.
Yeah, no,
but I also believe that we all age, and there is a natural aging process. So
yeah. That's a very good point. Well, I'd love to open it up to all of you because I know a number of conservators and art historians and curators here who I'm sure have your questions because we've all been very excited to have Kate here. So please, and we have a microphone. So is there a lead question? Wow, really? I could call on one of you to ask it. No, I'm just kidding. Here we go.
Related to the death of the object, as we have more ephemeral media and a faster transition between media, I was wondering if you have artists who the conservation is part of what they're thinking about when they make the piece, right? If you're starting to see some things that prepare for maybe the zombification of the object, right? That it's supposed to change over time, that it allows for there being this migration over time.
So technology related or not necessarily? I don't know. I'm looking to sort of the more material-based conservators that I know in the audience, thinking about works that are in chocolate or soap, or I know there's a piece in the collection here, is it by Doris Segaldo, that's of the rose petals kind of joined together. That's a super. Thank you. That's a super kind of. I can't think of anything where it's kind of built in. Can anybody else?
The lifespan of the work, you mean?
Yeah. Is that your question? No, none of the conservators can think of one either. I'm looking at.
What about that piece that the Hirschhorn has with the bee pollen?
Oh, right.
Or there's a piece at NMAI, an outdoor sculpture piece, but they're kind of allowing to decay. Oh, sorry. I think there's a piece at NMAI that's an outdoor sculpture piece that they're kind of allowing to decay over time, and the conservators have they're monitoring it, but they aren't actively conserving it. So I think it just depends on the artist.
It's an interesting, yeah, I don't know. Ken?
Thank you. Kate, at lunch we were talking, with the Harvard students. I explained this case about this Nam June Paik outdoor installation, which included the metal chassis of a television set, which is meant to rust over 20 or 25 years. And the intention is for it to rust, and then you get a new one. As that would be the intention. And how the Storm King Center has a wonderful installation of that, and they've bought some backup TVs, and I think they've had one cycle. 25 years later, they put in a new. They have bought several of these television sets, and I explained to you that the National Gallery of Art in Washington D.C., how their conservation team handled this. They have an outdoor Buddha called the Ugly Buddha, and they have a bronze Buddha and a bronze television set. There's no inside, it's just the shape of a television. So they can be outdoor, but there is also an actual metal television set, with all the guts taken out, so it's just the metal, which is meant to sit outside, so the Buddha will be facing the bronze sculpture and the actual television casing. And their conservation department would not let the curator install the metal TV outside because they did not want it to deteriorate, So I was wondering at MoMA how you would make such a call.
Oh boy.
So the curator, by the way, the curator I'm just curious, I have no opinion really either way. The curator at the National Gallery, Harry Cooper, was a curator here. Many of you know him, and he was rather. He knew that the National Gallery Conservation Department may make such a decision, which they did. So I told Harry, well, what are you going to do? Have a, install part of the installation indoor through the glass door? So it's, So I was just wondering how you may make such a call.
Well, fortunately, we don't have that work in our collection, so I don't need to really answer that. And
I could give you one and make share the problem with you.
And I think this goes back to that earlier question about zombification or something. And I think it's always, recognizing what the artist wants and what the artist feels about their work is really, really important. I'm not going to say it's the only person, it's the only stakeholder at that table, coming from like an institutional conservation perspective, but I do think it's very important to respect the artist's wishes. In a case like that, I think there's always going to be a very robust conversation about why it needs to go outside and what does it mean for something to go outside and what are the strategies in place to kind of deal with the issues that are going to come up. But that work was designed to be outside. But we see art has changed a lot over time. We're talking about interactivity. We look at pots in a museum that we can no longer use to cook in. We look at chairs that we can no longer sit in. So this is not a new thing, but I think with these works, we're just more aware that something has changed. And I think when we look at a pot or a chair in a museum, we kind of understand why we're not using it and why we're not sitting on it. But I think for these more contemporary works, it feels it's more of a challenge. We haven't got to a patina moment.
Yeah, you see, so right now, that so-called ugly Buddha sculpture is installed at the, on the roof of the National Gallery of Art, their sculpture garden, and there is just the bronze Buddha, which Nanjing sculpted, and a bronze, it's kind of a blackened bronze, just the chassis of a television set, and it's really missing the metal television, which is supposed to be rusting away, or if it snows, covered in snow. And, so it's sort of not a full installation, so to say.
Right.
And so anyway,
Yeah.
that was my question.
Yeah. It's challenging to shepherd these works.
Thank you.
Narayan?
Thanks. Hi, so I was just thinking about this, objects that are made that the artist determines that there is going to be a lifetime just by virtue of their approach to their medium. And I just wanted to ask you about how MoMA approaches those. I remember Bill Viola 20 years ago talking about the TVs and the technology that's used in his sculptures and how it's so specific that there's no variation that he would allow in that. And so he's, really determining that when those things are not available, that sculpture can't be exhibited anymore. And that's one thing with an electronic media thing. And the other thing is with, like Jeff Koons, he determines like Dr. J basketballs or a specific type of vacuum cleaner. And when that's not commercial, those things are not made anymore and they wear out. You put a basketball in an aquarium, it wears out. And at some point, there's not going to be any more Dr. J basketballs. So can you just tell us how you deal with those kinds of issues?
So the basketball piece that MoMA owns is currently on display in the National Galleries in Australia, the National Gallery of Victoria in Australia. And the actual basketball that's in that piece, you can no longer buy it. The design, I don't know much about basketballs, but I know that the lines and the logo has somehow changed. So you can't buy that same basketball anymore. So Linda Zeicherman, one of our sculpture conservators at MoMA, I know that she, a similar strategy was used of backups, but obviously they're rubber. We know that, I think they're rubber, that's going to degrade over time as well, that's a material. So that was one strategy that was taken. I know something that was discussed was maybe having somebody fabricate the basketball so it looked like the old basketball, but the other thing is talking to Jeff Koons about it. Bill Viola, I'm trying to think of one of his pieces where he has said that you can't change it. If we look at Bill Viola's work over, he was making big video art in the 90s and has continued to, he has definitely migrated his works. He has changed the technology in those works. I'm trying to think of one where maybe I can't think of one where the piece is specified that it hasn't changed. So what's really interesting about Bill Viola is we can sort of look at how he's addressed some of those questions over time. And he's one of those artists who is very much in control of his work. In contemporary art conservation, we talk about works that are thinly specified and works that are thickly specified. This is something that's been discussed a lot, and I think that Bill Viola's works have definitely been very thickly specified, and he's an artist who's very much involved in every single change that is made in his work. Yeah.
Jennifer.
Hi, thank you. That was terrific. I have a question that I think is not fully formulated, but I'll do my best, and it has to do with the way questions of physical conservation of these technologies intersect with curatorial and even pedagogical imperatives around this kind of work. And I'm thinking that along with the obsolescence of the actual videotape and playback mechanisms, there's also a uniquely, I think, rapid and poignant form of obsolescence that's happening to the audience as these works age. Because these are technologies that don't just exist in kind of technological history, but they have very strong affective and nostalgic links to the audience. So when I see a yellow Sony Walkman, I just want to cry because it's my childhood, coming back to me. And audiences have this kind of particular affective, personal, historical, nostalgic relationship to this work that I think is quite different from the way we would relate to a bronze sculpture or a painting or a print. And I just wonder, maybe Mary, you could talk a little bit about how you write the labels for a work that a certain percentage of your audience will immediately relate to in a particular way, and then a certain percentage of your audience won't recognize, will have a kind of blank emotional response to. Because again, what makes this work so interesting is that it is turning over so quickly, and it's being kind of date stamped on the audience's lives in a way that other media are not. And whether you think there might be any way of thinking about conservation and preservation as something that's also weaving through curatorial and pedagogical strategies. I mean, for me, I sit and talk to rooms full of Harvard students, and just last year, this room was filled with students, and I asked how many of them had actually seen a 16 millimeter projector in operation, and only 2 of 250 or 280 students had. So the audience is also moving quickly.
Yeah, that's very true. That's a great question. I'm installing this exhibition. It was great working with Marina as the Paik Fellow, who is a different generation, obviously, than I am. And so we'd be in the middle of looking at these television sets, and then the way Paik used what I called the snow. And she's like, Mary, what is that exactly? Okay, well, at the end of the day, the television, when I was growing up in the 60s, would turn into this moment of what people now call the blue screen, or whatever else you want to call it. The point being, when we were working on the labels and thinking about installing this, the whole idea of this changing technology was very much something we were afraid as we installed it that people weren't going to get it at first, because many of the objects look so much from a different era. So we decided to, in terms of explaining the objects, also put them into a context of how Paik's work really was a precursor for so much we take for granted today. Even TV Crown, which is what Marina began to speak with, the first time we installed that, and it was meant to be audience participatory, I said to the installers, who are also a different generation, look guys, this is what the first screensavers looked like, and they went, oh yeah, right, and it was this, so having a series of conversations and including this in our label work, and then even having a glossary on the wall, which was something new for Harvard Art Museum's exhibition, was meant to provide a historical context that would make people stop and look at things, perhaps thinking about the idea that some of what Paik was doing was really something we, as I said, already take for granted, but at the same time was really revolutionary within not only an art historical moment, but a moment in history worldwide. And taking that a step further by saying he used television sets the way a painter used a paintbrush, and that he saw them as a means of creating a new kind of expression, communicating with the world, making a kind of cultural interchange that people said the internet would do. And so I guess my point is we kept trying to think about these objects in ways that our audience would place them as stepping stones into what we already do and see, and giving that context as in many ways as possible without making it static and dusty and anything else like that. And I guess the kind of crowning point was the TV Buddha, having it there as you walk into the room. So this is and I hope everyone, the galleries will be open until 8, and I really hope you'll go upstairs and see all this. But the TV Buddha is like the original selfie sculpture. And we were certain once we installed it that would be something a lot of people would end up doing selfies with, since that's now something everyone does. But he was actually thinking about that way before and having us reflect in this way that's very humorous. And in fact, within the first 24 hours, we were counting the number of people who were taking selfies behind the Buddha and talking about that when we give the tours. as well, and the way in which Paik makes us reflect and did within the context of the Harvard Art Museums and teaching the history of art. I think it has been a really informative and kind of exciting way of having people stop and think about where the past has brought us and how he really was leading the way. I don't know, that was a very long way of saying, I think the number of people we've seen of all ages come in and really spend time looking at all these different objects by Paik has really shown that absolutely this work that may appear of a certain time period engages directly and refreshingly of the moment. And you couldn't know that fully until we've seen it in action, I'd say, in the last 5 weeks. So I don't know if you have more to okay. Anyway, yeah. I think we'll take one more question, and then I'm going to encourage you to go upstairs. Is that all? Yeah, sorry, please.
Hi, this is a question for Kate. I'm Flavia Perugini, Objects Conservator at the Museum of Fine Arts. And I deal with time-based media as well. And one thing I come across very often is the collaboration with artists, living artists, that you, Kate, talked about in your presentation. You stressed the importance of documentation and the ongoing conversation with the artist and capturing the artist's intent at the time of acquisition or receival of an artwork. My question is, how do you deal with artists changing their mind about preservation and treatment of their artworks while they're alive, of course?
Great question.
There was a conference in London in, I think it was 2015, called Media in Transition, organised by the Getty and the Tate. And one of the things that kind of really was spoken about there was about letting these works live and breathe. The idea that for them to survive, they need to flourish. And to some extent, do we need to feel comfortable with that as conservators, knowing that there is this kind of mutability in these works. Now, that doesn't mean to say, we were talking earlier, and I think Narayan was saying, you know, when Degas came, you know, you'd hide your paintings because he would want to paint it or something. I can't remember the exact example. So I think there's the sort of boundaries on there, or there's kind of parameters that some things we maybe are comfortable with the change with, because it feels like if we understand the work and the ethos of that work and the essence of that work, that, you know, we know that if something needs to change because it doesn't work essentially, and you're losing a part of the art, then it seems like an appropriate thing to do. So I guess it depends in what way the artist is trying to change the work, but I think these works do vary and change, and that, I think, kind of stewarding that is one of the sort of fascinating challenges of these works, because they are going to change a bit, but stewarding that in what seems like a kind of an appropriate way, because working in museums, we're very much interested in the history of these works, right? We're interested in the period of time in which they were made. So that's important to us, as well as the fact that the work needs to keep going or survive or change its technology to keep that work going. But we are also, that's why it's like, if you can show that 16mm film, why wouldn't you show a 16mm film? Why would you show it as a video when it was never really intended as a video, just because it's easier or something like that? So it's kind of like, I think with contemporary art conservation, it's being able to kind of navigate these sort of challenges that the artists and the technologies kind of present us with.
Also case by case. Well, thank you very, very much, Kate. Thank you for joining us.